President, honourable members, Commissioner, the European Union is deeply alarmed by the continued escalation in the Middle East following the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. The European Council has condemned and continues to condemn in the strongest possible terms such unjustified acts of deliberate violence and stands with the families of the victims and the hostages taken by Hamas. It has called on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint, put an end to all hostilities immediately, and fully abide by international law, including international humanitarian law. In Gaza, the European Union deplores the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, including women and children, as well as the catastrophic humanitarian situation. The European Union's position is clear. We call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional and immediate release of all hostages, the urgent improvement of access and sustained distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale throughout Gaza, and an enduring end to hostilities. We remain committed to continue to provide needs-based assistance to people in the Middle East, with particular attention to the most vulnerable. And given the increasing needs, we are scaling up the humanitarian engagement. Furthermore, the European Union stresses the essential role of the United Nations and its agencies, notably UNRWA, in providing essential services to millions of people in Gaza and the wider region. There is also further escalation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, following increased settled violence, the expansion of illegal settlements, and Israel's military operation. We strongly condemn this escalation. Regarding Lebanon, there is a growing humanitarian crisis and a serious risk for the political and security situation to further deteriorate. The Council hasn't had the opportunity to exchange views on the matter, but we follow the news on a possible ceasefire agreement and are hopeful that it leads to the end of hostilities and sustainable peace based on UN Security Council Resolution 1701. The recent statements from both Israel and Lebanon give way for cautious optimism. The European Union will continue supporting the Lebanese people, the Lebanese army, and the Lebanese institutions in coordination with our international partners. I can assure you that the situation in the Middle East will remain a priority for the Council. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boca. On behalf of the Commission, Madame Ferreira, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, honourable members, I am replacing now the High Representative Vice President, Josep Borrell, who could not be here today because he is in the G7 ministerial meeting in Rome. In fact, we don't have words to describe the unprecedented level of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. The Israeli operation in northern Gaza continues, leading to more casualties among civilians, a blockade of aid, and people being prevented from returning to their homes. There have been several mass casualties, bombings, and attacks on healthcare facilities and workers. The UN has warned that famine is imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip, which have practically received no humanitarian assistance for over a month. Either convoys are not allowed to enter, or if they are, looting prevents people from accessing the assistance provided. We therefore need an immediate ceasefire and release of all remaining hostages. We regret that the efforts of the US, Qatar, Egypt did not bear fruits yet. At the October plenary, you expressed clear support towards the United Nations UNRWA and rule-based international order. We are gravely concerned about the impact of the laws voted in the Knesset on the 28th of October, which can effectively obstruct all UNRWA's activities in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israel's continued attacks against the United Nations must stop. We have to defend our vision of a rules-based global order, especially when the UN Secretary-General, peacekeepers or a humanitarian agency are being threatened. UNRWA provides essential services to millions of people in the region, not only the West Bank and Gaza, but also Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. In addition to the delivery of life-saving support, UNRWA also plays a fundamental role in providing daily education, health and social services. No UN agency can take over UNRWA's special mandate. As repeatedly repeated by the UN officials, it provides services to individuals based on their status. Registered Palestine refugees in several human development fields, namely education, health, relief and social services, and emergency assistance. Let us stress that no other UN agency is specifically mandated to directly operate health or educational facilities. The Israeli legislation would directly impact UNRWA's delivery of essential education and healthcare services, leaving about 340,000 students and over 1 million patients without access to school or clinics over the occupied Palestinian territory. Additionally, more than 14,500 local jobs in education and healthcare, key for both service delivery and community stability, are at risk. Recognizing the disastrous consequences that this legislation would have to UNRWA's operations, the European Union reached out in advance of the vote in the Knesset to persuade the Israeli government to reconsider. First, the EU, through its delegation in Tel Aviv, made an outreach to the Israeli authorities, to which 17 member states and 6 like-minded partners were associated. On the day of the vote, the High Representative issued a statement urging the Israeli authorities to review its plans to adopt the bills. Then, following the vote, the High Representative Vice President issued a statement on behalf of the European Union in which he once again condemned any attempt to abrogate the agreement between Israel and UNRWA, reflecting what was agreed at the October European Council. The European Union also reiterated its firm support to the UN. Now that the laws have been adopted, we have called on Israel to ensure that UNRWA can continue carrying out its crucial work in line with its mandate adopted by the UN General Assembly. We believe we have to continue our strong advocacy efforts with key like-minded partners, including the UN and G7, towards the Israeli government. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has sent a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu requesting him not to implement the legislation. The legislation is due to enter into force in less than 90 days. As the UN itself has relentlessly expressed, there is no alternative to UNRWA. Thus, it is essential that we continue reaffirming our strong support of UNRWA further to the clear language in the European Council conclusions. As a sign of our support, the EU disbursed its entire financial support of €82 million for 2024. Finally, on the International Criminal Court arrest warrant issued on the 21st of November against the Israeli Prime Minister and his former Minister of Defense, we'd like to call for European Union unity. Now, more than ever, We need to uphold the multilateral order and continue calling for respect to and implementation of the decisions of the International Criminal Court. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Madam Commissioner. On behalf of the EPP Group, Madam Teodorescu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. I can't stop thinking about those two small boys, Kvir and Arjen, who are still in custody by Hamas, and the crying father whose daughter was taken on the 7th of October. He who didn't know which fate was worse, to know that Emily was dead or in the violence of Hamas. The girl was freed later, and she could only whisper to talk about the time in Gaza as being in a box. Yesterday we had the International Day against violence against women. We should have shouted out very loud against this terror, torture that Israeli women and children are being exposed to and are still exposed to in Gaza's claustrophobic tunnels. The silence is deafening. We need to draft a resolution on releasing the prisoners unconditionally and immediately, regardless of what the left in this House is trying to achieve outrageously. We have to make sure that the International Red Cross have access to the hostages immediately so they can be provided with services they need, and we need to deem that this constitutes a crime against a war crime. Hamas is using hostage-taking as a method to blackmail. And basically, Hamas has managed to do this and put Israel in a moral difficulty to force the country's leaders into giving in. But paradoxically, through doing this, this means that there are more incentives for Hamas to take more hostages and take their own population as human shields. The war in Gaza can be stopped at any time. All Hamas has to do is to release those 86 hostages, amongst them 13 women and 2 children, and lay down their arms. In order to achieve that, the Palestinian Authority has to take charge, throw out Hamas, and the West needs to see that there will not be peace in the region until Israel's existence is recognized by all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Mr. Maniatis, on behalf of the Socialist and Progressive Alliance Group.
Dear colleagues, from day one we supported the right of Israel to defend itself and protect its citizens and allow them to live in security and peace. However, this right has to be exerted in the framework of international law. The situation in Gaza keeps being inhuman. According to the UN, more than 90% of Gaza's inhabitants are internally displaced. More than 43,000 people have lost their lives. The decision to ban the operations of UNRWA is really unthinkable as a development. Abiding by the international law is not a voluntary task, and that was reminded by the International Criminal Court last week. The only solution is the unconditional release of hostages and the effort for a sustainable solution based on the two-state solution according to the UN Security Council resolutions. An independent Israel that will be able to protect its citizens, and an independent, democratic and sustainable Palestinian state at the borders of 1967. Thank you.
Colleague, el señor Martín Frías.
The next speaker is Mr. Martín Frías on behalf of the PFE Group.
Señorías,
Ladies and gentlemen, the Commission has played a very regrettable role since the beginning of this on the 7th of October 2023. And putting this on the same level as the ICC and Josep Borrell has done, putting the equivalence of Hamas and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, shows a lack of moral clarity, and it shows the extent to which multilateralism is rotten to its core. How many warrants has the ICC issued against, for example, the criminals in Caracas and Tehran? Israel needs to protect itself and protect its citizens. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Martin Frias.
Mr. Riausen from the ECR group, on behalf of the ECR group.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the humanitarian situation is as bad as it is in Gaza is worrying. We have to do everything we can to make sure that help gets through. And I think that's something we can all agree on here quite quickly. But if that's our main concern, then I don't really understand why the Commission and a number of other colleagues are only looking to UNRWA as if they're the only body that can help. Because that isn't, in fact, the case. There are indeed other alternatives. What about the UNOCHA, the UNHCR, the World Food Programme? These are bodies that have been established to provide short-term help and to work in conflict-ridden areas. And now that Israel has rightly outlawed UNRWA because of their links to Hamas, we're going to have to deploy other agencies to do that work. But of course, let us not in all of this forget that the hostages are there. And today, once again, I say to Hamas, let them go. And to those member states who are just lining up behind the ICC blindly and who want to have Netanyahu arrested, I say you are mistaken. Countries have their own responsibility here, and they have at least an obligation to check whether the basis for the arrest warrant is sufficient, because there are some considerable question marks there. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. On behalf of the Renew Europe group, Madame Boutmans.
Thank you. I wanted to stick to my speech, but having heard what Mr. Riausen just said, it's a bit difficult. The war in Israel and Palestine is something that's really holding up a mirror to our own situation. And Mr. Riausen didn't talk about China or Russia's involvement here, but when the Western allies are confronted by that same international law, we hear deafening silences, even protests, even failure to recognise that here in Parliament's benches. So when the ICC has issued these arrest warrants and we ignore them, then the ICC is not worth anything anymore. And ladies and gentlemen, the dramatic humanitarian situation has to be taken into consideration. It's incredible to see what has happened. Before the attack, 500 lorries were allowed through, and now 37. Now, I have questions here. How are we going to make sure that the ICC warrants will be respected by all member states? And secondly, how are you going to make sure that UNRWA now immediately gets access? Because, Mr. Riausen, there is no alternative. 13,000 staff in UNRWA. I know the Commission always goes over their time, so I'm going to do this as well. 13,000 people who can do that.
On behalf of the Greens European Free Alliance is our colleague, Madame Vieira.
Dear Chair, dear Commissioner, international law emerged as a safeguard against the horrors that humanity should never repeat. But that safeguard is under immense pressure today. In Gaza, we see unthinkable destruction, mass displacement, civilians that are deliberately targeted, and starvation being used as a method of warfare. So naturally, internationally recognized judicial bodies are ringing all the alarm bells about Israeli war crimes. The ICJ concluded that there is a risk of genocide. The ICC issued an arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu. But what does this change? Israel is still a major Western partner. Our weapons are still being exported there. Our agreements are still not being questioned. Some member states are even outright dismissing the ICC decision. If we apply double standards for Israel, why would anyone adhere to the rules? International law only works if it's strongly enforced, regardless of the perpetrator, and that is what the European Union must do.
Muito obrigado. Our next speaker is Madame Boylan on behalf of the Left Group in the European Parliament.
The international order is very clear. Targeted attacks against civilian infrastructure with the clear aim to cut off men, women and children from water, electricity and heating are pure acts of terror. These are war crimes. I absolutely agree, and so did President von der Leyen, because they are her words in October 2022. However, fast forward to November 2024 and the ICC have issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, citing starvation and the deliberate deprivation of food, water and medical supplies to a civilian population as the basis for the charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet there has been radio silence from President von der Leyen, and frankly the mealy-mouthed responses from some member states have been shameful. The EU's credibility is in shreds, not just in Palestine and the global south, but even within its own member states. Israel is driving a coach and horses through the institutions of international law and multilateralism, and they are being aided and abetted by these institutions. Arming Israel is complicity with genocide. Trading with Israel is complicity. Absence of sanctions is complicity. International law depends on the willingness of governments to support justice, no matter where the abuses are committed or by whom. The failure to defend international law is a threat to all of us. This is not about politics, it's not about personalities, it's about justice. It's time to sanction Israel.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Pasamos a la segunda parte.
We'll now move on to the second part of the debate and I have the honour to give the floor, first of all, to Mr. López Istúriz White. Thank you very much, President. Once again, we're gathered here, like every month over the past year, to talk about this awful conflict, but without bringing any solutions. But it will be enough for the social media and the press releases of the left. And it can be used for their electoral campaigns. We need to provide solutions, and I have been looking at these. If we recognise that it was Hamas that started this tragedy, that it was and it's Iran that's funding Hamas and Hezbollah, if you call for the release of the hostages and the fact that Israeli people, especially women, have been attacked, and the right for Israel to exist and not be deleted from the map, unlike what you have been calling for so often, if you have these 5 points, then it's worth coming to this plenary to debate that. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Sánchez Amor. You have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente. Tono, yo...
Thank you. Well, those 5 promises there. Double standards are cancer in the EU's external policy, and they erode our credibility worldwide, and particularly in the global south. And despite that, we carry on frivolously exhibiting this every time we deal with the Russian war of aggression and Israel's abuse of the self-protection. Talking about anti-Semitism, if there's any criticism, is avoiding this of meaning. We are throwing this accusation out right and left, and that people need protection. This is international right. We can't have an international law for Russia and a different one for Israel, and we need to have the same position with similar violations. And this is something that the international courts have arrest warrants for, and this is something that we've seen in terrible proportions in the Gaza Strip.
Sánchez Amor. Our next is Mr. Berhoff.
Děkuji za slovo. Já se budu věnovat.
Thank you very much. I will only attend to the issue of UNRWA. Are they really essential? Are they really important? Or is UNRWA part of the problem? UNRWA has been around for decades and decades. In fact, it has been raising generations that are dependent on assistance. And it is not only about humanitarian aid, they have other projects as well, but look at their education. Look at what they're teaching those children. Look at what UNRWA staff is teaching. Jihad against Israel, jihad through the heart or through the sword. How can you have an independent office taken into office then its former boss met regularly with terrorist organizations? All the more important are the pieces of information showing that some members of staff were involved in the horrible attacks. UNRWA made it possible for their infrastructure to be misused for violence. If we want UNRWA to be truly essential, it needs to be reorganized, because at this point it's more part of the problem than the solution.
Mr. Coles, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, the escalation in the Middle East calls for moral clarity and actionable pragmatism. Israel has every right to defend itself against terror, and peace cannot be built while hostages remain captive. We demand their unconditional and immediate release. But let's address another obstacle to stability: UNRWA. This organization, intended as a temporary measure, has evolved into a bureaucratic nightmare. From educational curriculums promoting hatred to the misuse of facilities by Hamas, it has abdicated neutrality and failed its mandate. Alternatives do exist, as we have heard in public expert discourse. Yet Mr. Borrell has continued to fuel anti-Israel sentiment, shifting the overtone window to dangerous extremes. This failure of balance does not foster peace, it undermines it. Events like the recent pogrom-like violence in Amsterdam show us the consequences of this recklessness. Peace in the Middle East demands engagement from all regional players and solutions that address root issues, not one-sided narratives or institutional inertia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coles. Our next speaker is Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, President and Commissioner. I would like first of all say that Mr. Coles is wrong, of course, that the European Union carried out a very extensive evaluation to satisfy itself that there is no risk whatsoever of the diversion of EU funding from its intended purpose, and that has been established time and time again by the European Commission. And I would call on the President of the Commission to make a statement putting the full weight of the European Commission behind a request to the Government of Israel to request the Knesset to extend the 90-day period, because, as everybody knows, there is no replacement for UNRWA. As our HRVP said, all ICC decisions are binding on all Member States. Despite the overwhelming support of EU Member States, we have had no statement from the President of the Commission, and I think it's reasonable to conclude that that silence undermines the legitimacy of the Court and of international law. In the EU Action Plan on the ICC, it states, and I quote, "The EU and its Member States will undertake consistent action to encourage full cooperation of states with the ICC, including the prompt execution of arrest warrants." Thank you.
Mr. Andrews, you have a blue card coming from our previous speaker, Mr. Coles. Do you accept it? Thank you. Our next speaker is Madame Kunki.
Thank you, President. War crimes, crimes against humanity, the most serious and most disgusting things that human beings can do to each other. It's you who are refusing to do what needs to be done to stop Netanyahu has made this possible. And all those civilians, most of whom are women and children, being killed in Israel's attacks, or who die of famine because food, medicines and other necessary provisions are not being provided. We're never going to get those people back, nor the hostages who've been killed in Hamas's tunnels. But we still have time to rethink this and do the right thing. Maintain the arrest warrants of the ICC. Pause the association agreement of the EU with Israel. bring about an immediate arms embargo and increase the support to UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Oliveira. Obrigado.
Quando propusemos este debate, tentaram
When proposing this debate, an attempt was made to talk about the decision by Israel. We talk about the rights of the Palestinian people. With the initiative from the European Parliament, we want to give a voice to the Palestinian people. But it's not the agency itself that we should be discussing, but the Palestinian people and Palestine and its people. It is the humanitarian response that we need. 2/3 of primary care in the Gaza Strip is provided. With this attempt to prevent UNRWA activities, there are Palestinian refugees who are condemned to hunger and illnesses. And what we need to think is, what will the EU do to defend UNRWA?
Next speaker is Mr. Brown.
Szczęść Boże. Trwa kolejna debata na temat.
Well, we're going through yet another debate about genocide in Gaza. And this genocide is being carried out by the Jewish terrorist state, and that's happening because a prime minister of a member state has invited the premier from Palestine and guaranteeing immunity, whereby the ICC is calling for Netanyahu to be arrested. So this debate should have happened at a higher level, perhaps. Following the experiment of a state set up following a democratic UN vote years ago, with an EU initiative, perhaps we could call upon the UN to vote for the end of the experiment that has led to genocide. I'm wrapping up, President. Some people are talking about a two-state solution. The President is interrupted.
Very much, dear colleague, your time. Our next speaker is Mr. Mandel.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Defend democracy and rule of law, separation of powers, independent justice, freedom of speech and opinion, freedom of press. And these are pillars our civilization is about. And who is fighting at the utmost frontier for this civilization and for these values is the Israeli Defense Forces, and it's the Israeli government, and it's the Israeli people in the first place. So I very much listen also to courts, but I also very much use my right to say my opinion in the framework of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And I think Churchill won Second World War not alone, but he was the leader. Netanyahu will win the war for this very civilization, not alone, but he is the leader, and he will be politically defined by the people of Israel in the first place, because this is a democratic country, and this is one other of the pillars of our civilization, and this is also what people in The Hague, decision takers there, should understand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mandel. Madame Insir.
Let's be clear about the actions of some individuals and political groups in here. It is hypocrisy to question the ICC arrest warrant. It is shameful that the far-right groups and the conservative EPP attempted to block this issue from today's agenda. I expected such behavior from anti-democrats, but what justification does the EPP group have? The ICC arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Gallant, and Hamas Commander-in-Chief should not be questioned by anyone. It's an obligation of all our member states to implement it. It is their obligation, not question it by anyone. Respect for international law must be maintained consistently, regardless of who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And as far as I know, there is not an international law for Israel and another international law for the rest of the world. There is no difference between perpetrators and those silently and actively watching people being killed. Don't forget that silence is to be complicit. Stop defending war crimes for God's sake.
Thank you, dear colleague. Now I give the floor to Madame Gencheva.
Thank you, Chair and dear colleagues. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is an urgent matter that affects hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. We must acknowledge the essential role played by the humanitarian agencies actively working on the ground. UNRWA, as a leading organization, provides food, shelter, and health care to nearly 2 million people, and it's responsible for 63% of primary health care just in Gaza. And it's only the only UN organization, UN agency educating more than 350,000 children in Gaza and in the West Bank. Those services are crucial for the well-being and dignity of the people there. Yesterday, positive news regarding the possible peace deal for Lebanon offers a hope, a powerful reminder that peace is achievable. We must extend similar efforts to Gaza, promoting a two-state solution. As a union, we have the capacity to play a more active role in fostering peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Le doy la palabra ahora a la señora.
Ms. Miranda has the floor.
Ahora mismo,
600,000 children need to be vaccinated against polio in Palestine as we speak. Up to 1 million people have found refuge with the help of the UNRWA there. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe to stop UNRWA getting into Gaza and the West Bank, Commissioner. There is no plan B for Netanyahu's government. If UNRWA can't get through, no one will give aid to the Palestinians. No one will do that. However, Israel has a plan A, and that plan is two-step. Those of the far right, ethnic cleansing and genocide. What he's doing is genocide. The ICC admitted a clear warrant. He's a war criminal, and they need to be prosecuted in Europe too. But Ms. von der Leyen, who'll be here tomorrow, didn't even bother to comment about this. That is a true disgrace. The UNRWA is caring for the Palestinian people who have no hospitals, and these people are being assassinated. Long live the Palestinian people. Thank you, Ms. Miranda.
You are the next speaker.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What is happening in Gaza, what is happening against the Palestinian people is a genocide. The left has condemned the imperialist attack of Putin in Ukraine, the attack of Hamas, the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. However, the history did not start with the attack of Hamas. There were other incidents before that with decisions and rulings that had not been accepted concerning the existence of the Palestinian state. There are not two standards in international law. The two bills adopted by Knesset are blocking the operations of UNRWA, that is the main humanitarian aid provider in Palestine. It is a dehumanizing policy, the policy of Netanyahu. Please read the arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court in the same manner as you read the previous resolutions, not applying double standards. Choose whether you side with legality or illegality. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is one single action that could decisively change the situation in Gaza: the release of the hostages by Hamas. Unlike an ICC arrest warrant that oversteps its competences, it's been 417 days. The State of Israel has had to fight repeatedly for its survival. The attack of October 7th was not spontaneous. It was backed by extensive military preparations and significant funding. Israel, understandably, is now determined once and for all to ensure its security with all its might. However, the release of the hostages by Hamas would put significant pressure on Israel to alter its current actions in Gaza. Releasing 100 hostages in exchange for improving the humanitarian conditions for millions of Palestinians. Only terrorists devoid of any humanity can reject that logic. Israel is offering $5 million per hostage to anyone who assists in their liberation. Blurring the lines between terrorists and civilians, as well as the tolerance of terrorism, is one of the greatest threats to any society. I hope more and more people will become aware, engage in this fight, and draw a clear line between those who are willing to embrace the values of life, dignity, and humanity, and those who don't.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Madame Temido.
Senhor Presidente, Senhora Comissária.
President, Commissioner, the last special report from the UN is very clear. In Gaza, the Palestinians have been the target of a campaign that is targeting them because of their ethnicity. This mass assassination and dehumanization is on an ongoing scale. These tend to be in keeping with the same things as we define genocide with. We can see the socio-economic rights of the Palestinian people being abused. We're seeing an apartheid situation, basically, and that is the situation where we now see the ICC establishing arrest warrants. This is not a political decision, it is a legal one. 132 states have signed up to the ICC, and the European Union states are amongst their signatories as well. This level of warfare is unprecedented. We must respect this ICC mandate. It always comes at too late a stage, and this is why we insist that member states of the European Union respect the historic note of that has been given, and that we respect human rights law.
To Madame Joveva.
Thank you. I used to believe the European Union embodies its core values. But how can anyone still believe that? What we are witnessing is crimes against humanity. Israel went as far as to making targeted deadly attacks on UNRWA staff and property, and when that didn't make them leave, they decided to ban them. Still, the EU's silence and failure to condemn Israel's actions means we are de facto supporting it. I'll admit I was hopeful last week that the EU will stand united in backing of the ICC ruling to issue arrest warrants against senior Israel leaders and Hamas officials, as we portray ourselves as defenders of the rule of law. Yet, once again, the deeply rooted double standards have prevailed. You should be ashamed. And to all of you who still pick and choose when and for what, You uphold EU values, there's no decision to be made. Do better, colleagues, and be quiet when the children are sleeping, not when they are being killed.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Madame Fourreau.
S'en prendre à
Attacking UNRWA, as Israel's doing, is definitively saying that you want to eradicate the Palestinian people. Doubting its neutrality in Europe is to affirm that international law has no value anymore for the defences of genocide. The worst war crimes ride roughshod over international law and hamper humanitarian actions. Netanyahu is killing people very slowly and plunging people into humanitarian disasters, and this is something that NGOs and doctors have seen. They're powerless to change. The EU needs to respond firmly by suspending the association agreement and reaffirming support. All member states should and must implement the arrest warrant from the ICC. The struggle for peace is the greatest battle, Jaurès said. Let's add that there's no peace without justice. Justice for the Palestinians.
A continuación le doy la palabra al señor Estier.
Mr. Estier.
Kolegice i kolege, slušajući neke rasprave, mogli bismo se zapitati.
Thank you. Well, we could ask ourselves whether there is any difference between Russia and Ukraine and Israel, because their leaders have been indicted by the ICC. But there is a fundamental difference between them. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia launched an aggression, and on the 7th of October 2023, Israel was a victim of an attack of aggression, and that is the key difference. So if people ask us why do we treat Israel and Russia differently, that's why, because Russia launched an aggression and the other country was the victim of an aggression. It doesn't mean that a victim of an aggression can do whatever they want. They have to abide by the international law, and if they fail to do so, they have to be held responsible. But the international community must not treat a victim and the aggressor in the same way, and we cannot do it here in this House.
Mr. Nemetz.
Dear colleagues, in the light of daily war crimes committed in Gaza and Lebanon, the ACC arrest warrants are a grim consolation for tens of thousands of victims. I welcome ACC's decision and call on all states to respect it and to defend international law and institutions. Let's be clear, protecting international law and ensuring accountability for all, regardless of nationality or position, is imperative. The ACC must fulfill its mandate to uphold justice and prevent future violations. This applies equally to Putin and Netanyahu, both facing war crimes charges. What's even more striking than the double standards often applied, including the EU institutions, toward Israel is the silence of President von der Leyen. Silence is complicity. In 2012, the European Union received prize for its contribution for post-war peace in Europe. The question is, does it still deserve it? The actions of its leaders speak for themselves. Not in my name. Ceasefire now. Sanctions now. Peace now.
Thank you, dear colleague. Next speaker, Madame Diab.
Dear colleagues, nothing can justify the brutal Hamas attack on October 7 or the suffering of Israelis still held hostage. While recognizing Israel's right to self-defense, it is impossible to justify its response, resulting in over 40,000 civilian deaths in Gaza. And I want to address this humanitarian catastrophe happening in front of our eyes. This winter, millions of Palestinians face hunger and diseases, lacking homes, food and medical supplies. And the role of UNRWA is vital. It is providing essentials like food, water, healthcare and education, and there is no replacement in the region. Israel's bills labeling this UN agency as terrorist organization take effect in 2 months, yet, as I said, there is absolutely no viable alternative in the region that can replace this agency's crucial aid. Let me be clear, Israel has no plan B for war refugees, and if we all fail to act, history will judge us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Mr. Clausen, you have the floor.
Arrestordren fra den internationale domstol var klar.
Thank you. The arrest warrant from the ICC is clear. The Israeli government has systematically violated international law with direct attacks on civilians, denying medical care, for example, and this is having horrendous repercussions for the Palestinian people. And how can the EU defend this? What will happen if there are no consequences to this after January? There needs to be an arms embargo and there needs to be sanctions imposed against Israel as well. I'm ashamed of what the EU is doing. It's so hypocritical. The EU says that they support international law and humanitarian law and fundamental rights, but then we have innocent Palestinians being killed. We cannot simply take that approach. We need to see action, not just words, and we need to prevent these war crimes against Palestinians.
Thank you. You have the floor.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the lethal attack on the 8th of October in Israel, where the result was also 10,000 people killed, including children, and the unrelenting attacks of Israel and the attacks of Hamas as well, often supported by the Iranian regime. We can't see any good side to this story, can we? There's only one side on which we need to stand, and that's on the side of international law. Europe has to do more in the spirit of peace, both in supporting the victims and sanctioning the perpetrators of violence. We need to find a sustainable solution to the Middle East, and we need to start with a lasting peace. There is mention of this. Maybe we can take that first step. Now, where is Europe to make this possible?
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Madame Strada.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, for the second time, we're back here talking about Gaza and the Middle East, but without a text to vote on, meaning that the EP is not speaking in the face of genocide, humanitarian catastrophe. We talk about Ukraine every month and we vote to support victims, but we don't say anything about this. This is a huge violation of human rights and international law, the invasion of Lebanon, the arrest warrant for Hamas, the terrible anti-UNRWA law, which makes the situation worse for the Palestinian people. I would like to thank the High Representative for keeping keeping standards up for human rights. But looking at the possible ceasefire in Lebanon, we can only call for what we have asked for since the start: a ceasefire in Gaza, stopping exports of arms to Israel, freeing hostages when these are terrorists and heads of government.
Our next speaker is Madame Terlak.
I'd like to ask you to stop for a second. 90% of those who live in Gaza don't have a house anymore. Of all those who have died, 4 out of 10 are children, most of them between 5 and 9 years old, and access to humanitarian aid is 0. We cannot look the other way. At the moment, this region is unstable across the board. There's fighting going on, and humanitarian organisations such as UNRWA are absolutely essential to provide services and to avoid further victims. And we have to continue to work on a peaceful and sustainable solution. It's a complex conflict. The negotiations on a ceasefire and negotiations on the liberation of all hostages need to press on, because it's only together with all stakeholders can we reach a solution for this conflict.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Rutten.
Thank you, President, Commission, colleagues. De geweldsspiraal in het...
The spiral of violence in the Middle East is continuing day after day, and we consider this normal. The normal numbers of victims are disappearing into page 6 and 7 of our newspapers, and the destruction of the Palestinian villages and also Lebanon not being talked about at all. We have to stop this violence. There is no justification for the unimaginable number of civilian victims through violence, but also through displacement and famine as a weapon. The international law needs to be followed up. The ICC's arrest warrants are justified and binding, purely and simply. Mr. Netanyahu's death campaign undermines peace and undermines the release of the hostages, in fact, because Mr. Netanyahu has left these hostages in the lurch from the very start. And from the EU, it's an embarrassing lack of any attack on Israel, suspending the association agreement, stopping any kind of organizational cooperation. You should not be subject to violence because of your nationality.
Dear colleague, the floor belongs now to Mr. Sedechowski.
Děkuji, pane předsedající.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Well, personally, I rarely comment on decisions of any court because justice should be independent from political powers. However, as a citizen, I refuse the use of International Criminal Court for political interests. An arrest warrant against someone who is defending their citizens against barbar attacks. Those who commit those horrendous crimes are Hamas leaders. And what right do the court representatives have to assess the suffering of civilians who were expelled from their homes, who were tortured, etc.? How come that the International Criminal Court takes a light on this kind of suffering? I want to live in a society which supports law, and we would need to say no to this decision.
We come now into the Catch the Eye. I remember you that those speakers who will receive the floor will be able to talk only for 1 minute and from their seats. I have lots of petitions and only 5 minutes, so I will try to give the floor to as much as colleagues possible. First place, Mr. Sokol, you have the floor.
Thank you. On the 7th of October 2023, we saw the deadliest attack on the Israeli people since the Second World War. Let's be frank. Israel has offered a hand to Palestine so many times, allowed the Palestinian Authority to come into being. Ehud Barak allowed the Palestinians to rule the Western Bank and Gaza. Ariel Sharon ordered the Israeli soldiers to withdraw from Gaza and for the settlements to be reduced. So much money was poured into Gaza. They could have become a new Switzerland, but they built those tunnels, amassed weapons in order to be able to attack Israel. The terrorist organization Hamas has to stop existing. Any other solution is shameful, and it is sad that some of the members are trying to equate the victims with those terrorists, and there are so many people who are using hate speech and justifying terrorism. And we have to support Israel's rights to self-defense, because this is a threat not only to Israel but to Europe, and we have to support Israel in its just fight.
Halul.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza. For humanitarian aid to reach families in northern Gaza. We have always condemned the terrorist attacks of Hamas, 7th of October. We demand release of all hostages with no conditions. Families are suffering, and Netanyahu is not bringing them back home. We need an arms embargo that will avoid more deaths. We need terrorists of Hezbollah to surrender arms and to reinforce the Lebanon government and Lebanese institutions. We need to support the ICC decisions because we support them for Putin. So we need to support their decisions for Netanyahu, that is responsible for the killings of thousands of civilians. We need to maintain international law system. We need peace. People in the Middle East has the right to live. The life of Jews and Arabs was the same. They are brothers and sisters. Ceasefire now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Muchas gracias. Perdón. Our next speaker, Mr. Moreira de Sá.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente. A política externa.
Thank you very much, President. The foreign policy has forgotten Cardinal Richelieu's maxim, according to which states are not eternal. So there are idealists around, but they can destroy European ideals. We see the presidents such as the American president, incoming president, and the Hungarian president, and yet here we are seeing Mr. Netanyahu, who is being attacked. We have enemies, and we have our enemies' enemies, but it seems in Europe all we have is just enemies.
Muito obrigado, Madame Camberry.
Thank you, President. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached unprecedented levels, with countless lives depending on indispensable work of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Suspending funding for UNRWA would be catastrophic, cutting off critical services to millions of Palestinian refugees. No organisation matches UNRWA's comprehensive aid delivery in Gaza, and recent Israeli legislative efforts to ban its operations threaten to violate international law and jeopardise regional stability. At this critical moment, the international community must uphold humanitarian principles, stand against these violations, and strengthen support for UNRWA's vital mission to save lives and maintain stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Madame Grappini.
Domnule președinte, doamna comisar, stimați...
Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, I don't think we should use a double standard here. We have two conflicts, and we should have the same definition of the attacker and of the person and of the victim defending itself. The hostages have to be released. We've been discussing this since October last year, and not all of the hostages have been returned. We need several paths in order to offer humanitarian aid, but we cannot say that Israel is the only guilty party here, as long as Hamas is an attacker and a terrorist organization that has organized attacks in the past. I think we should be fair and find a solution for peace in order to keep people from dying and to keep children from losing their parents and not having access to food. This is the right solution, not taking sides depending on different principles. We have to treat international conflicts in the same way.
El señor Asens.
Gracias, presidente. Señora...
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. The warrant by the ICC is against Netanyahu, and he be a fugitive of justice, and he needs to be held responsible. However, we need to look at USA and Europe as well, because Western leaders don't participate in Netanyahu's crimes, but they make them possible with their financial, political and military support. The hundreds of thousands of victims, most of them are women and children, are pointing the finger at Netanyahu, but Western action is not without responsibility. The West has their hands stained in blood. One day, some other people will receive warrants from the ICC. It's not just an instrument to persecute Putin and enemies or crimes committed in Africa. Now it is becoming independent. So many of you will not sleep calmly because justice is taking place and this needs to be supported. Thank you.
Mr. Botenga.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Hvala lijepa.
À qui elle a serré la main, un grand sourire, à qui elle a promis tout son soutien, l'homme à qui l'Europe vend encore des armes, à qui on donne des fonds publics européens, mais aujourd'hui, la Cour pénale internationale dit qu'il faut l'arrêter pour crimes contre l'humanité, pour crimes de guerre. Eh bien, l'embarras de Mme van der Leyen qui n'arrive pas à faire un tweet pour dire « Ah ben oui, Poutine, oui, je veux qu'il soit arrêté, mais Netanyahou, mon allié, mon ami, doit être arrêté aussi », est palpable partout dans le monde. Et partout dans le monde, on voit que cette Union européenne a 2 poids 2 mesures, même si elle prétend que non, que les vies palestiniennes ne valent pas